on introducing ethics in psychology, thinking through multiculturalism. So I'm going to be taking you through a few things. If I speak fast, can you just tell me to slow down? Because
Sure.
I do have a tendency to speak a bit fast. So besides that, I'm going to take you through quite a few things in this presentation. Hopefully, I'm not going to speak too long because I am sure some people want to go and have a nice weekend. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through definitions and terminology. I'm going to talk about ethical values, ethical theories, ethical codes, specifically relating to multiculturalism. Then I'm going to introduce you to a case and take you through an ethical framework on how we can resolve that ethical dilemma. Throughout the presentation, I will add a few critiques of what has been done in the area, and I will talk about the link between our personal ethics, our professional ethics, and societal ethics. Right. So
Thank you.
ethics is really at the heart of what we do in our profession. And as professionals in psychology, we really have a duty to serve the people that we work with. And people place a very high level of trust in us as psychology professionals. So this places a responsibility on us to really be the best we can be when we're working with other people. So trust is really at the forefront of everything we do, and we can't take it for granted. I mean, ethics has often been taken for granted in our training. It's not often spoke about in undergraduate level. We speak about more often in postgraduate level, but we aren't really talking about how are we applying it, what are we going to do moving forward, how important is it. And so if you read Alfred Allen, he often says that psychology professionals, when we have an ethical dilemma, we react. And prior to reacting, there's no critical thought about what it is that we're going to do, what is the consequences of our decision. Is this in the client's best interest? These are not things that often are thought about. And in addition to ethics, we also need to think about multiculturalism in our context because South Africa is a very diverse country. And even two people that might be racially the same and religiously the same, there might be another component in which the two people are not the same. And trying to understand across all these contexts, whether we're working in research, whether we're working in organizations, whether we're working in counseling, education, or training, multiculturalism is a component that affects all the work that we do. So we always need to think about what is our responsibility. So I think if you're a professional already working in the field, I think we think more about this, but when you are a student, it might not be as apparent. And so one of the recommendations in some of the textbooks that have been written recently is that we need to actually introduce ethics curriculum into our undergraduate degree so that we are able to develop better professionals for the future. Okay, so historically, ethics generally was developed since the 1800s, and it was mainly developed in relation to the medical field. However, after World War II, it was found that Jews, Soviet citizens, Poles, Serbs, disabled, Freemasons, Spanish people, homosexual people, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many other people were forcibly experimented on and had no say about what happened to them. They were discriminated against based on ethnicity, religion, politics, beliefs, and sexual orientation. People were experimented on, forcibly sterilized, incarcerated without, without any reason. There was sexual slavery and there were so many atrocities that perpetuated against people that were not considered by Hitler to be the norm. So after World War II, when all these atrocities became known, the world really had was pushed by that system
Sorry, Fatima, I think we lost you for a second. Can everyone still hear her?
No, it went off a bit.
Yeah,
Did
the
it?
sound is the issue.
The sound went off.
Okay. So
Sorry.
what I was saying is that after World War II, when all the atrocities committed by Hitler and his army what became known, the world reacted and decided that we need to protect the public and we need to do more regarding codes of conduct and how professionals and other people should behave, because Hitler justified that the reason why he was doing all these atrocities to people was to advance medicine and to advance science. But the ethical question is this in the best interest of himself with his prejudices, or is this in the best interest of society, which it wasn't? So ethical codes that were developed, the first one being the Nuremberg Code, and this was one of the first ethical codes that was developed after World War II. And then the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was developed, and 51 countries signed the declaration. So that was a very important document, because the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it once countries signed the document, they basically were agreeing that they were going to implement these rights within the legal framework and all other contexts in their country. After um, after the United Nations Declaration was developed and implemented, the American Psychological Association formed a committee where they then began to work on a standard ethical framework for psychologists in the United States of America. So, um, so an important thing about ethical codes is that South Africa is also one of the signatories for the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And so, based on our history of apartheid and the human rights violations that was committed by the previous government, the South African government instituted that human rights become part of all the legislation in the country. And so one of the highest levels of legislation in South Africa is the South African Constitution. And in the South African Constitution, there's a document called the Bill of Rights. In the Bill of Rights, it specifies all the rights and obligations we have within society. So, based on international treaties that were developed, this thing had a knock-on effect, and it improved the legislation within our country to ensure that these forms of atrocities are not going to happen in the future. Okay. So now let's just talk quickly about terminology. So in education, it's often said that if you understand the terminology, you are better able to master the discipline. So in ethics, as in anything else, there's core terminology that is used. And this terminology, if you understand what the term means, you'll understand how you can use it and what is being asked and so on. So generally, ethics is understood as the overarching field, and it's meant to ethics is about what is right and wrong and what is it that people believe. And so ethics is about morality, and morality is determined by society. What does society think is right and wrong? But it doesn't matter what country you are in, because different people have different beliefs. So no one country will have the same beliefs as another country. In South Africa, given our variation and diversity, it's clear to see that there is a strong variation in beliefs. And so whether you are in education, training, counseling, in an organization, we need to be aware of this variation and make sure that we don't unduly harm other people without having thought about the consequences of what we are doing. Okay, so these things called ethical values, ethical principles, ethical codes, and ethical standards. And an ethical value or principle are general values and beliefs about what is right and wrong. So These can be things such as beneficence and non-maleficence. But also, it can be individual beliefs. What do you believe about things in general? So, values, which relate to values and principles, are things that are very general, and the words values and principles are often used interchangeably. So, values and principles are, are things that different people believe to different degrees. Maybe one person will believe autonomy takes precedence over well-being and beneficence, and another person believes that non-maleficence takes precedence over justice. So different people interpret the ethical values differently. But all the ethical values that we know of in our profession applies to the ethical code. And an ethical code or standard is the beliefs that we have about our profession. What do we as professionals think are the standards that we all should be held liable against? So, for example, if we talk about an ethical standard or code referred to as misrepresentation, we will understand that misrepresentation is about a person, whether the person is a BA degree or a normal person out on the street. If they tell other people they are psychologists and can do diagnosis, then this person is actually misrepresenting themselves and they are infringing upon the Health Professions Act. And the Health Professions Act in South Africa is legislation. So in other countries, there are ethical codes for professionals that are not necessarily legal documents. These could be organizational documents such as CIS's ethical code. But in South Africa, it's actually part of legislation, the Health Professions Act. And so if the Health Professions Council of South Africa finds that somebody is misrepresenting themselves, that person can actually be punished through the court of law for misrepresenting themselves. So standard codes are used, the terminology is used interchangeably. So that distinction is quite a relevant distinction to make so that we understand that values principles such as confidentiality and beneficence are actually spoken of inside the code. So all codes standards have the ethical value inside it. Okay. Okay. So in the slide, we're talking about personal ethical values, professional ethical values, professional standards. And when I think about ethics, I always think about the fact that when we are growing up as children, we are taught what is right by our parents, by our communities, by our culture, by our religion. And a lot of times we don't think about these values. Are these values things that we actually believe in, or have we just taken them from our parents? So sometimes when we're working in these very diverse contexts, we need to think about what is the consequences of our beliefs on the people that we are working with. And I want to make this example. So in some people's households, right, they could be taught that homosexuality is wrong. And so if a client or a student walks into your office and you pick up that this person identifies from a homosexual nature, then you could inadvertently harm this person. And as psychology professionals, you then breaking the trust that this person has in you, that you're going to help them. If they're your student, you have a responsibility to help your students. But if your student walks away and feels as though they feel hurt and infringed upon, then we haven't actually fulfilled our obligation as professionals. So professional values are things, like I said, are things like beneficence and non-maleficence. And we need to understand that these ethical codes was Originally, the American Psychological Association developed the Ethical Code of Conduct, and this code of conduct became the standard against which many other professional organizations in other countries compared what they were doing, and they used the APA as a baseline to do what they were doing. But it became quite clear, and as I was saying, individuals have different ethical values. Societies have different ethical values, and so you can't directly apply the way in which ethics is spoken about in an American context, in an African context, or in a Chinese context. However, even though you can't directly apply these principles, it's important to recognize that as psychology professionals, our primary mandate is to always do what's in the client's best interest and not our own. So, you know, if you think about ethics, it's important to understand that ethics or values and principles, you can't be punished for values or principles. But ethical codes and standards that have been agreed upon within any organization, if it's not followed, you can actually be punished for it. So ethical values are more general, whereas ethical codes are very specific. The other thing about ethics is, as professionals, we need to ask ourselves, what type of professionals do we want to be? Do we want to be the professional that follows rules and regulations and don't break them regardless of what the situation is? Or are we professionals that want to aspire to be better professionals? Because depending on if you're the one or the other, or if you take parts of one and mix it with the other, it will influence the ethical decisions that you make. So, that. So, when we think about the concept of multiculturalism, the first thing that I've said now multiple times is that we have to do the best and provide the best service that we can without doing any harm. So multiculturalism refers to all aspects of diversity that could differentiate people from each other. And according to the APA, Ratz and Peters defines multiculturalism as aspects related to race, culture, class, religion, sexuality, ableness, and many other factors that impact on all aspects of work professionals in psychology do. And when we are, as professionals, we have the ethical responsibility of developing our own competence and to be open about what it is we don't know. So if I can make this example, say a client comes to you and the client has a difficulty, and for example, the client is not from the same racial group. If we use race as an example, it's not from the same racial group as the person giving the service. Then, because we know from critical social theory that race matters and impacts on everything, the counseling relationship won't develop well if the counselor or the lecturer doesn't actively acknowledge the distinction and difference between the people, and a positive working alliance can't be achieved between the people, because multiculturalism really does affect everything that we do. So we actively need to develop ourselves in order to become competent. And what that means is that we need to reflect on what do we believe, why do we believe it, and learn more about each other so that we are able to understand where the other person is coming from. And we can't do this in a counseling or in a lecture situation. We should be doing this in our own time to develop our own competence, to learn about other cultures, other languages, other beliefs, so that when we meet people in a counseling practice, we are able to serve this person as best as we can. Right. Is everyone still with me?
Yes, I'm here. I'm listening.
Yes.
Yeah, we just muted.
Okay, great stuff. So ethical values are things that you will have a belief about whether you agree or disagree about the abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, and many other things. And things such as your professional values, beneficence and non-maleficence, will interact with your own personal beliefs about these different things. So we need to try as best we can to find a way to combine our what we believe as people to develop our professional identity to match with our professional values, because it becomes quite psychologically challenging for the professional if they believe something but the professional code says something else. Then that is a personal ethical dilemma for you and me as professionals that we need to resolve. So ethical values are incorporated into all ethical codes of conduct. And there are many different ethical codes of conduct that has been developed in the world. American Psychological Association is the most well known. The Australian Psychological Code of Ethics, the British Psychological Code of Ethics, and the South African Specific Conduct Guidelines in Psychology, and the Canadian Ethics. So these are some of the ethical codes of conduct that have been developed internationally, and you can read up on them if you're interested. I think that the Canadian Code of Ethics is quite a well-developed code of ethics, because in addition to having started and decided from the beginning for them as professionals what are their ethical values, they also decided to look at the ethical values and develop the ethical codes from what they believe is right or wrong for their given society. So the Canadian Code of Conduct is quite a good one. And it actually, as I'm going to speak in the slide, so the Canadian Psychological Association actually says that standards of behavior in one country's ethical code isn't directly applicable to the ethical standards in another country. So ethical standards is influenced by social and moral climate and the tradition and laws of that specific country. And because the Canadian Psychological Association acknowledged this difference, they were able to develop an ethical code which spoke to them as professionals in their current context. So when we look at these ethical codes from a multicultural perspective, Sue Adredeno and McDavid in 1992, they found that the American Psychological Association Ethical Code of Conduct actually was not addressing the multicultural needs of the society, and it was very one-sided, and it didn't actually take into consideration that as in their country, with the amount of people immigrating there was actually quite a high proportion of people that needed psychological services. But because of the fact that the ethical code didn't acknowledge the multicultural component in their society, the code didn't address it. And so since then, there's been a number of changes to the APA to make it more multiculturally sensitive. Okay. So in the next section, I'm going to take you through ethical values, and I want to differentiate between the CISA ethical code and the HPA ethical code. Right. So as you can see on this particular slide, the Health Professions Act is the legislation for the Health Professions Council of South Africa. And the South African Professional Conduct Guidelines in Psychology is the ethical code for CISA. So what we need to understand is that the ethical code of conduct for CISA is actually meant for all the professionals that belong to the organization. And it's not all psychology professionals that belong to the psychology profession, so they can't be held liable against it. However, the Health Professions Act is applicable to all South Africans, whether you belong to it or not. So if you are found to do something unethical, they can punish you. So that is the distinction between CISA Ethical Code and HPA. Also, the purpose of each organization. SAISA as an organization is meant to assist professionals and fight for professionals with the aim of helping professionals best serve society. Whereas the core purpose for the Health Professions Council of South Africa and the Health Professions Act is to protect society. So the aim of each organization is different. However, if you look at the slide, you can actually see that there's an overlap between ethical values between the two ethical codes. So you see respect in both ethical codes, you see human rights in both ethical codes, you see integrity, you see competence, and you see professional and scientific responsibility. So these values are actually infused in both ethical codes. And what is good is the fact that this alignment ensures that HPCS and SAISA has the same norms and standards for the profession, which is a good thing. So let me just quickly take you through some of the things. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but let me just briefly just talk about each of the different values. So beneficence is about in the counseling relationship or organizational relationship or student lecturer organization relationship, you need to make sure that you as the professional always are a benefit to the client. Whereas, apologies, whereas non-maleficence is about not doing any harm. So if a student comes and the student is from a different race or a different culture, always making sure that we know what our beliefs are and we don't indirectly harm the person coming into our offices to get help. Then we have the value human rights. And as I said, human rights comes from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's in the South African Constitution. It is something that speaks to what are each of our rights, but inherently in what is our rights is the question, what are our responsibilities? Because we can't infringe upon another person's right. So at the end of every person's right is the beginning of our responsibility to another person. Then there is the ethical value of veracity or truthfulness. And because we as professionals are trusted so highly and respected, we always need to be as truthful as we can be without harming anybody. So truthfulness and telling the truth is a central ethical value. And then we have the one called integrity. If you read up on the concept of integrity, you often find that it does incorporate many other ethical values. And so it can stand on its own to incorporate the other values. The other ethical values that you can see is social responsibility and community. And this goes along with social justice, doing what is good for society. You know. Any questions? Okay, so.
No, nothing.
Hey.
Nothing yet.
Okay, so in the next session, I'm just going to take you through ethical theories because you know when you're faced with an ethical dilemma and you're thinking through what you're going to do, it's very useful to know what are the different ethical theories out there and what is it that you are thinking about and what is the thing that you can best do. So these ethical theories have been developed by people like Immanuel Kant, Benjamin Bentham, Mill, and many other people. And these ethical theories facilitate that we are better able to work through an ethical dilemma. So yeah, these are all called normative ethical theories. And the first one, these are the overarching systems of ethical thought. The first one is called deontology or deontological non-consequentialist ethical theories. So deontology talks about what are the rules, and it states that we must follow the rules regardless of the consequences of these rules. So the deontology was developed during the times when religion, the Abrahamic religions, became very popular. And so in a religion, you find that there are rules such as do not steal, do not murder. And these rules must be followed regardless of the consequences. And if we think about those rules, those come from a deontological ethical theory. Then we have teleological consequentialism or utilitarianism. These theories form a body which says that you can't make a decision without thinking about the consequences of your decision, because the context and the consequences have a direct impact on the decision you make. So from an ethical standpoint, when you think about teleological, if I make an example, it's not a great example, but say for example, we could go back in time to when Hitler was a baby, and we know now that Hitler had killed many people. So if we could go back in time and kill Hitler and make a decision about what are we going to do? If we kill Hitler, then we are serving the broader community. And then the question is, are we going to sacrifice the few to benefit the many? Or are we going to sacrifice the many to benefit the few? And what is it? Baby Hitler's, what is our ethical responsibility towards him? Because baby Hitler didn't actually commit any crimes. So what should you actually do in that ethical dilemma? If you could go back in time, which we all know you can't. But that is the basic type of thinking when we're talking about consequentialism or teleological ethical theory. Then, virtue ethical theories talk about, in health and in the social sciences, many people come to these disciplines because you want to help other people, because you want to be a virtuous person, because you want to be a good person. And all these ethical theories are about what is best for society, what is good for society. So it's not about doing what is in the best interest of the one person. So say, for example, this person comes to your office and you're a registered counselor, and this person asks you, please write a report for this person because they want to get a promotion at work, and if they get the promotion, they'll pay you a lot of money. So what's in that person's best interest isn't in society's best interest. So when we think about ethical theories, it's always important to remember that it asks you what is in the best interest of society. And clearly, it's not in the best interest of society to defraud your medical aid and lie on a report to get a promotion and to get a kickback. So virtue ethical theories and teleological ethical theories and all ethical theories always work from the premise of what is best for society. So talking more directly to virtue ethical theories, there are things that are considered, or values that are considered virtuous. And so virtue ethical theory proposes that as professionals, we're always striving to be the best version of ourselves as professionals. And so doing good and helping people and doing what's in the best interest of the people is actually at the center of virtue ethical theory. And then we have feminist thought. And feminism critiques these ethical theories because they say that it is actually very masculinist and very one-sided in the way that it speaks about morality and what is good or bad. And these other ethical theories actually don't take into consideration that as human beings, we are relational and interconnected. And when we make a decision, we make it within the context of other people. So it's not just about this is the rule, we must follow it. It's about what is best for the other person and how best can we serve that person. And then the last group of ethical theories that I'm going to speak about is the human rights-based ethical theories. So as I said, human rights is a base of a group of ethical theories that speaks about what is our rights and what is our responsibilities. And as I said, it's infused into the Bill of Rights in South African Constitution, and these are also reflected in society. Right. Okay, so this slide is demonstrating that there's a link between what ethical theories are, what are ethical principles, and what are ethical judgments. So that when we make an ethical decision, we give good reasoning and we systematically think through what it is we're going to do, how it is we're going to do it, and what do we think are the possible consequences for that decision. You know? So these ethical theories and systems of thought have been critiqued for being very westernized and Eurocentric, and they haven't thought about the historical and cultural context of people in other countries. So Mkhize is one of the people that have actively critiqued these ethical theories because he says it's not universal. And if you want to read more on thinking about multiculturalism and how it applies to people from in a more African context, you can read Ubuntu Botho Approach to Ethics and Invitation to Dialogue by Mkhize. It's in the book African Perspectives of Ethics in Healthcare. So to illustrate the example, in one of the articles by Mkhize, he says that if a client goes to a doctor and the doctor says to the client that he's going to insert the loop as a family planning method, and he asks the woman in a Western context, the woman would make the decision and say, yes, okay, they're going to do it. Whereas in a different context, maybe an African context or Chinese context, when a woman is asked if they want the loop, they might say, I'm going to first speak to my husband and my mother-in-law and the elders so that I can make an informed decision about if this is something that I want to do. So as the Canadian Psychological Association acknowledged when they developed their ethical code, cultures, religions, and beliefs are different from context to context. But at the center of everything is always what it is that is in the best interest of the client or the student or the person that we're serving. A further critique about ethical theories is the epistemic racism or violence, because many of these theories were developed by people in Europe and they considered people from Africa to be inferior. So these ethical theories, they portray themselves, or it is portrayed to be universalistic when in actual fact it's not. So that is another critique of the various ethical theories. Okay, so in the next section, I want to just take you through the specific ethical codes that are applicable to multiculturalism that are in the Health Professions Act and in the CISA regulations. Okay, so just to illustrate, these are hierarchy in the codes of conduct, right? The Health Professions Act is the highest code of conduct because you can actually go to jail if you infringe this code of conduct. Whereas CISA professional conduct guidelines are guidelines for people that belong to CISA and they are held accountable to it. But CISA is also very they're helpful in the way that they approach ethical problems because they try and mediate between the professional and HPCSA because that is they need to help professionals, and then there are us professionals in our professions and our own personal beliefs and our own codes of conduct, and that in the hierarchy at the end of the day it's right at the bottom. Okay, so the first ethical code, so just to start off with again definitions and terminology. If you're reading the Health Professions Act or you're reading the CISA guidelines, they use the term psychologist. And psychologist is a unitary term that is being used to refer to all other professionals in psychology, namely psychologists, psychometrists, registered counselors, psychotechnician, and students, because students are also registered with the HPCSA, those that are doing PSAC. So if the legislation says psychologist, it doesn't mean that if you're a psychotechnician that you can call yourself a psychologist, because you can only practice within your scope of practice, and your scope of practice is determined by your qualification and training. So if you haven't trained or qualified in a specific qualification, you can't call yourself by another designated category's name, namely psychologist. So that is just, if you're teaching other people about ethics, You just need to make sure that they understand that the term psychologist refers to all professionals, but it doesn't mean that they can call themselves a psychologist. So the ethical codes that are applicable to multiculturalism would be number 2, which is professional relations. 2.1, respect for human rights and others. 2.1.1 reads as follows: psychologists shall respect the dignity and worth of the individual and shall strive to the preservation and protection of fundamental human rights of all professional conduct. And 2.1.2, psychologists shall respect the right of others to hold values, attitudes, beliefs, and opinions that differ from their own. 2.3 speaks about unfair discrimination and says a psychologist shall not impose on all categories over whom the psychologists have or had authority any stereotypes of behavior, values, or roles related to age, belief, birth, conscience, culture, color, disability, disease, ethnic and social origin, gender, language, marital status, pregnancy, race, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or any other basis prescribed by law. And when you read this specific code, the same characteristics you will find in the Bill of Rights. The same terminology, age, belief, birth, is found in the Bill of Rights. Also relating to undiscrimination. So 2.3.2 talks about the professional activities, psychologists shall not engage in unfair discrimination based on all those categories, age, belief, birth, etc. Then 2.3.2, psychologists shall make every effort to ensure that language appropriate and culture appropriate services are made available to clients and that acceptable standards and language proficiency are met in the provision of services to clients whose mother tongue varies from that of the service provider. And then under assessment, it's about cultural diversity, and it speaks to psychologists who perform intervention and conduct research with tests or other assessment methods shall use scientific procedures and current professional knowledge for test design, standardization, validation, or elimination of bias and recommendations for use. 5.5.2, psychologists shall recognize the certainty with which diagnosis findings or predictions can be made about individuals, especially where linguistic, cultural, and socioeconomic variation exists. Psychologists shall make every effort to identify situations in which particular assessment methods or norms may not be applicable or may require adjustment in administration, scoring, interpretation, because factors such as age, belief, birth, color, conscious culture, disability, disease, ethnic and social origin, gender, language, marital status, pregnancy, race, religion, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status exist. So, when you read the following, you will see that it reads as though there's an overlap between the two codes, which again speaks to the fact that there's alignment between the codes. So under number 1, which is General Standards for the South African Professional Conduct Guidelines of SISA, it says respect for human difference. With difference of age, gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, or socioeconomic status significantly affect psychologists' work concerning particular individuals or groups, psychologists obtain the training, experience, consultation, or supervision necessary to ensure the competence of their service, or they make appropriate referrals. Respecting clients. In their work-related activities, psychologists respect the rights of others to hold values, attitudes, and opinions that differ from their own. Non-discrimination. In the work-related activities, psychologists do not engage in unfair discrimination based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status, social class, or any other basis prescribed by law. Well-being of clients and other professional relationships. Number 2.6, stereotyping. Psychologists shall not impose on a client, student, supervisee, employee, research participant, or any other whom the psychologist has or had authority any stereotypes of behavior, values, roles related to age, gender, religion, race, disability, nationality, or sexual preference with the objective provision of psychological services to the client. And 2.13, which is avoiding harm. Psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, research participants, students, supervisees, and others with whom they work, and to minimize harm where it is foreseeable and unavoidable. Right. So in the next slide, I just want to take you through a case study and then apply an ethical framework. Right. So this case study was taken from Gibson, Swartz, Sandberg in the book called Counseling and Coping. And the case study reads as follows. A very religious woman named Bilquis consulted patients, a Christian trainee counselor, because of concerns she was having about her child's unwillingness to go to school. It was obvious from the beginning that there were enormous differences between the two women. One of the first issues patients had to deal with, and she discussed this at length with her supervisor, was her own reaction to the clothing worn by Bilquis, who was always completely covered from head to foot. With help from her supervisor and from Bilquis herself, Patience was able to go beyond her feelings that this form of dress automatically created a psychological barrier between the two women. The relationship between them deepened, and though there were enormous differences between them in terms of how they saw the world, they were able to work together happily, not denying their differences but recognizing their commonalities. So, there are many different ethical frameworks, those that are written by people like Bond, Walfall. Even if you read Sys's Code of Ethics and the Health Professions Act, at the end of the act, they actually have a number of steps you could follow to resolve an ethical dilemma. But the one I'm going to introduce you to is the one by Walfall. So, according to Walfall, the first step is to develop ethical sensitivity. And as I have been saying, this is something that we do every day, and we always strive to learn about other people and cultures all the time. So this is, I think, a standard for all of us in the world as it currently is, because we are a global world and things are not as homogenous in terms of culture and religion and beliefs as they used to be. Step number 2 is clarify facts, stakeholders, and the social cultural context of the case. So as you can see in the case, Bilquis is Muslim, whereas Patience is not Muslim, Patience is Christian. And Bilquis, her cultural dress is something Patience is unfamiliar with and uncomfortable with. And so number 3 asks, define the central issue and available options. And I really like what Bond says. Bond says, ask yourself whose problem is this? Is it your problem as the professional, or is it the client's problem, or is it both of your problem? And if you read the case, the problem is clearly the counselor's problem because it's counselor's discomfort about something about the client, and it doesn't have anything to do with the client, it has to do with herself. So what is the central issue? The central issue in the case would be around patient's perception about what the client's appearance looks like. So step number 4 is refer to professional standards and relevant laws and regulations. So prior to this, I went through the Health Professions Act and I spoke about the codes that are applicable. And so if you didn't remember those codes, you could always go back to the Health Professions Act or the CISO document and read up on them just to refresh, because no one remembers these codes out of their brain all the time. So number 5 is search out ethical scholarship. And what you would do here is, depending on your problem, you will go to the literature, Google information on multiculturalism and dealing with hijab attire, covering your face. How do other counselors in other contexts deal with this particular thing, to get some information? And then you must apply the ethical principles to the situation. So you would think about what is in the best interest of the client, which is beneficence. How do you not harm the client, which is non-maleficence? What is the client's autonomy and a right to self-governance, and justice? What is best for the client, or what would be most just for the client? Like, you think about what are the ethical values or principles that would be applicable to this particular case. And what was nice about this case is that Patience actually was self-reflective. She thought about what is her problem, why does she have this problem, and she sought out speaking to a supervisor, because when any professional is under supervision, the supervisor is the first person they should speak to about the problem, whether they're embarrassed about the problem or whether they feel they should know what to do. The supervisor is the first person you actually should be speaking to, because the supervisor according to the not Health Professions Act, according to Form 258, which is the guidelines for registered counselors, the supervisor will stand in front of HPCSA to explain what the student had done, because the student is under the supervision of the psychologist or whoever the professional is. So first, as a standard of practice, students should always be encouraged to speak to their supervisor. But also, having a mentor and speaking to respected colleagues that know about this thing is also a useful way to resolve whatever problem you're going through. And then in step number 8, deliberate and decide. So if you read Corey and Callanan's ethical framework, you will see that they say list all the possible courses of action that you think you could do. Then in the next step, list all the consequences of each of these actions. And in the last step, they say, choose the one that is in the best interest of the client. So that is what Walfal is talking about, deliberate and decide. And then number 9 is inform your supervisor, implement and document decisions, making process and actions. So when you're making an ethical decision, it's imperative that you keep record of what it is you did, why it is that you did it, who it is you consulted, so that if for some other reason you are called by the HPCSA to explain why you made any ethical decision, you are able to justify what you had done and that you were doing what you thought was in the client's best interest. And then step number 10, which you can't see here, is to reflect on your decisions moving forward. Okay, so challenges about ethical decision-making frameworks. So all of the frameworks that I've seen thus far and that Pettifo and Ferrero critique is, they say they're all based on ethical principles, and these ethical principles are not equal, and it's very difficult to weigh up what ethical principle should take preference over another ethical principle. So Mkhize also says that ethical values differ depending on context and culture. So this is another consideration that we should make. So these ethical frameworks are at best what we have now. And so in as much as these are the critiques for these ethical frameworks, it's still better to use something than to just make a decision without having thought about anything. Okay. So in conclusion, I've done all the things that I had proposed in the beginning I was going to do, which is talk about ethical codes, ethical values, introduce you to HPA, introduce you to CISA, compare your own personal values with professional values and societal values, and I've given some critique. So thank you so much for listening. And back to you, Maham.